October 1964. The air in the meeting room of the Presidium of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in the Kremlin seemed thick and electrified. Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev, who had just returned from a holiday in Pitsunda and had been summoned to this emergency meeting, did not yet fully understand that he had fallen into a trap. He looked around at the familiar faces of his comrades in arms, Brezhnev, Kosygin, Podgorny, and saw something new in their eyes: cold detachment. But the main conductor of this silent drama was not the loud Brezhnev or the manager Kosygin. At the center of the web, invisible but omnipotent, was Mikhail Andreevich Suslov. When the conspirators began to act, they understood that simply removing the first secretary was only half the battle. Such a move could be perceived as a banal palace coup, splitting the party and causing an unpredictable reaction in the country and around the world. Legitimacy was needed. They needed a man with impeccable party authority, whose words would sound not like the opinion of a conspirator, but like the verdict of history itself. Suslov was neither the organizer nor the power behind the conspiracy. His role was more subtle and far more important. Suslov was the party's chief ideologist, its high priest, the guardian of Marxist-Leninist dogma. In the party hierarchy, he held the post of second secretary of the Central Committee, which made him de facto the second most important person in the party on ideological issues. His ascetic lifestyle, his pedantry, and his reputation as an unyielding theorist created an aura of conscience of the party around him. It was he who was entrusted with preparing and reading the main indictment at the plenum of the Central Committee, which was to take place on 14th October. The plenum meeting room in the Catherine Hall of the Kremlin buzzed like a disturbed beehive. Hundreds of Central Committee members who had gathered from all over the country whispered among themselves, trying to understand what was happening. And then a tall, thin man in his usual strict suit and thin-rimmed glasses slowly climbed onto the podium. It was Suslov. He did not raise his voice. His speech was monotonous and devoid of emotion. But this made the points of accusation he read out sound even more weighty and frightening. He did not accuse, he stated. With the methodical precision of a pathologist, he dissected Khrushchev's mistakes and miscalculations one by one, presenting them not as isolated failures, but as a systematic departure from Leninist norms of party life. Suslov's report lasted several hours. It was not just a list of complaints. It was an ideological justification for Khrushchev's dismissal. Every economic venture, every harsh statement, every personnel decision made by Khrushchev was presented through the prism of a violation of party principles. Suslov turned the conspiracy of a small group of individuals into a collective and principled decision of the entire party, aimed at saving the country from a leader who had gotten out of hand. He closed the violent seizure of power in garments that were impeccable from the point of view of the party bureaucracy. Without his report, Khrushchev's removal would have gone down in history as an ordinary coup. With his report, it became an act of restoring Leninist norms. To understand the depth of this conflict, we need to go back 8 years, to February 1956, to the historic 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. It was there that the rift began, which, over time, turned into a chasm between Khrushchev and Suslov. Khrushchev's closed report on the cult of personality and its consequences was a real shock for Suslov. Mikhail Andreevich was a man of the Stalinist era through and through. For him, the stability of the system and the unshakable authority of the party and its leaders were absolute values. He saw Marxism-Leninism not as a guide to action, but as sacred scripture that could not be revised, only interpreted. And suddenly, the head of the party, Nikita Khrushchev himself, took to the podium and lashed out at the recent past, debunking the myth of Stalin's infallibility and calling into question the very foundations on which the entire ideological construct was based. For Suslov, this was not just a mistake, it was sacrilege. He saw de-Stalinization not as purification, but as destruction. If we condemn Stalin today, what will prevent us from condemning Lenin tomorrow? If the party could be wrong for decades, what guarantee is there that it is not wrong now? These questions undermined faith in the party as the bearer of the highest truth. The consequences were not long in coming. Unrest in Poland, the bloody uprising in Hungary in the autumn of 1956. Suslov and his supporters directly linked all this to Khrushchev's reckless reforms. In their opinion, he had let the genie out of the bottle, undermining the monolithic unity of the socialist camp. Khrushchev, with his impulsiveness and faith in his own intuition, believed that it was impossible to move forward without condemning Stalin's repressions. He tried to give socialism a human face, to make it more flexible and more open. He flirted with the intelligentsia, allowing publications such as Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which for Suslov was tantamount to ideological sabotage. Suslov perceived each such step by Khrushchev as another nail in the coffin of the communist idea. Their confrontation was a clash of two worlds: the world of Khrushchev's lively, chaotic, and often mistaken practice, and the world of Suslov's frozen, calibrated, but dead theory. The ideological differences were too complex for the broad party masses to understand. A simple, understandable, and damning label was needed, and Suslov found it: voluntarism. This term, meaning the making of decisions based on subjective desires, divorced from objective laws and real conditions, became the main battering ram that broke through the armor of Khrushchev's authority. It was this word that Suslov emphasized in his report, and he had plenty of examples to illustrate his point. Agriculture. The famous corn epic became a textbook example. Impressed by the successes of American farmers, Khrushchev decided to make corn the queen of the fields throughout the Soviet Union. The order was given, and local party officials, eager to curry favor, began sowing huge areas with corn, from Arkhangelsk to Central Asia, often ignoring climatic conditions. The result was ruined crops and huge economic losses. It was pure voluntarism, an attempt to dictate to nature how it should grow. Administrative reform. In 1962, Khrushchev initiated the division of party bodies, regional and district committees, into industrial and rural ones. This ill-conceived reform caused incredible confusion in the management system, gave rise to parallel power structures, and provoked deep irritation among the entire party nomenclature. Regional secretaries, whose power had been fragmented, became natural allies of the conspirators. Suslov merely voiced their general discontent, calling it yet another manifestation of subjectivism. Foreign policy. The Caribbean crisis of 1962, which brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, was also presented as a consequence of Khrushchev's adventurous, unilateral decisions. The accusation of voluntarism hit the mark. It united all those who were dissatisfied: ideologues frightened by reforms, economists tired of endless experiments, and the party apparatus, whose stability was threatened by constant reorganizations. Suslov presented Khrushchev not as a communist, but as a despot who ruled the country based on his whims, desires, and momentary impressions. As a result, in October 1964, Suslov and his associates presented Khrushchev's removal not as a seizure of power, but as a rescue of the party and the country from the destructive voluntarism of its leader. However, this cold determination in the eyes of his associates did not arise overnight in October 1964. It had been brewing for years, fueled by fear, irritation, and the quiet, methodical work of Mikhail Suslov, who, unlike the impulsive Khrushchev, never forgot insults and ideological deviations. The most important moment that determined their future split was June 1957, when the so-called anti-party group, Molotov, Malenkov, Kaganovich, and Shepilov, who joined them, attempted to remove Khrushchev. At a critical moment during a presidium meeting when the majority was against Nikita Sergeyevich, it was Suslov who, after agonizing hesitation, supported Khrushchev's line. He did so not out of sympathy for the first secretary, but out of cold calculation. The Stalinist orthodoxy was dragging the party into a past that could not be brought back. Their methods were too crude and could lead to an open split. Suslov understood that a more subtle, more bureaucratic form of control was needed to preserve the system. By supporting Khrushchev, he helped him stay in power, but in return he received the tacit right to consider himself the guardian of ideological purity, the one to whom Khrushchev was indebted. And Nikita Sergeyevich, in the euphoria of victory, did not appreciate this debt, believing that now he could do anything. He did not understand that Suslov had simply postponed his sentence, waiting for Khrushchev himself to provide sufficient evidence against him. And the evidence was not long in coming. The final point of no return for Suslov was the 22nd Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in October 1961. It was there that Khrushchev, developing the theme of de-Stalinization, went too far. At the suggestion of the Leningrad delegation, a decision was made to remove Stalin's body from the mausoleum. For Suslov, who saw the mausoleum not just as a tomb, but as a sacred symbol of the continuity of power, a sanctuary of the communist faith, this was blasphemy. He watched as workers carried the sarcophagus away under cover of night, in secret from the people, and saw this not as historical justice, but as a cowardly act of vandalism that undermined the very foundations of statehood. If this could be done to the body of the leader, what would remain sacred? It destroyed the mystical aura of power, turning it into a succession of temporary rulers. At that moment, Khrushchev, in Suslov's eyes, went from being a leader who had made ideological mistakes to a heretic, a destroyer of the temple, who had to be stopped at all costs for the sake of saving the faith itself. This ideological rejection was compounded by entirely pragmatic considerations, which Suslov skillfully exploited. Khrushchev's reform to create Sovnarkhozes in 1957, designed to decentralize economic management, actually resulted in chaos. It destroyed the vertical links between central ministries in Moscow and local enterprises that had been established over decades. The huge army of Moscow bureaucrats who were losing their posts, power, and privileges turned into a powerful opposition force. They did not dare to speak out openly, but their silent discontent created a fertile environment in which a conspiracy was brewing. Suslov, like no one else, sensed the mood of this bureaucratic swamp. He did not agitate them, but his unwavering position and silent condemnation of Khrushchev's innovations served as a beacon for them. They saw him as the guarantor of a return to the familiar, stable order, where every cog in the system knew its place. The pinnacle of voluntarism, which clearly demonstrated to the entire country the harmfulness of Khrushchev's style, was the so-called Ryazan affair, or Ryazan miracle in 1959. The first secretary of the Ryazan Regional Committee, Alexei Larionov, seeking to curry favor with Khrushchev, made an impossible promise to triple the state's meat procurement in the region within a year. To fulfill the plan, not only all commercial livestock was slaughtered, but also dairy cows, calves, and even the personal livestock of collective farmers, which was bought up for a pittance. When this was not enough, meat began to be purchased in neighboring regions at the expense of budget funds allocated for construction and education. Khrushchev was delighted. Larionov was awarded the title of Hero of Socialist Labor, and the Ryazan experience was imposed on the whole country. But within a year, the scam was exposed. The region was left without livestock, meat and milk production collapsed, and Larionov, driven to despair, shot himself. This tragedy was not just the mistake of one official. It was a direct consequence of the system created by Khrushchev, a system where showmanship, loud slogans, and personal loyalty to the leader were valued more highly than the real state of affairs. For Suslov and his like-minded colleagues, it was a perfect example of how one person's subjectivism, multiplied by the sycophancy of the apparatus, leads to national disaster. Khrushchev's behavior on the international stage caused no less irritation among the party leadership. His famous banging of his shoe on the podium at the UN General Assembly in 1960, his vulgar threats to show Kuska's mother, all this was perceived by the old party guard as a disgrace. Accustomed to Stalin's impenetrability and Molotov's Byzantine diplomacy, they saw Khrushchev as an unpredictable, ill-mannered man who was damaging the prestige of the great power. Suslov, with his pedantic accuracy and dry bureaucratic style, considered such behavior unacceptable. He saw it not as strength but as weakness, a lack of culture and statesmanship. Each such excess added another stone to the scales, which were inexorably tipping against the first secretary. The conspiracy itself was not a spontaneous decision. It had been carefully prepared for several months. The roles were clearly distributed. Leonid Brezhnev, chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, was responsible for the facade. He was to become a compromise, non-threatening figure as successor. Alexander Shelepin, former head of the KGB and at that time chairman of the Party State Control Committee, and his successor as KGB chairman, Vladimir Semachasny, provided security cover and control over communications. They ensured that Khrushchev would be completely isolated from the parts of the army and special services loyal to him. Nikolai Pogorny and other members of the Presidium worked with members of the Central Committee in the regions, preparing them for the coming changes. But they all understood that without Suslov's sanction, their actions would look like a rebellion by a group of careerists. It was to Suslov, in his office on Staraya Square, that the conspirators came one by one. They did not speak directly about the removal. They complained about the unbearable situation, the damage being done to the party, and Nikita Sergeyevich's unpredictability. They appealed to his role as the guardian of ideology. And Suslov listened without interrupting, his impassive gaze looking through the thick lenses of his glasses. He did not give his direct consent, but he did not say no either. His silence, his nods, his phrases about the party having to find a way out of the current situation in strict accordance with Leninist norms were taken as a blessing. He gave them ideological indulgence, transforming them from conspirators into saviors of the party. He seemed to be saying, "Go ahead, and I will ensure legality." When Khrushchev was tricked into leaving Pitsunda, supposedly to discuss agricultural issues, and entered the Presidium meeting room, he initially attempted to act as the host. Seeing those gathered, he exclaimed, "What, has the anti-party group gathered again?" But the joke hung in dead silence. Brezhnev was the first to speak, but his speech was incoherent and unconvincing. Then Suslov took the floor, and it was no longer a conversation but a verdict. After his hours-long report, in which every fact was tailored to accuse Khrushchev of voluntarism, subjectivism, and creating a new cult of personality, this time his own, Khrushchev realized he had lost. He tried to appeal to the members of the Central Committee, who had been urgently summoned to the plenum. He hoped, as in 1957, that the broad party masses would support him. But he did not take into account that over the past years, his reforms and personnel reshuffles had turned almost the entire party apparatus against him. Most importantly, he did not take into account Suslov, who had prepared this plenum as a tribunal. At the plenum itself on 14 October, Khrushchev was given the floor. He spoke incoherently, tried to justify himself, listed his achievements, space, virgin lands, housing construction. But no one listened to him. The hall, manipulated by the conspirators and stunned by Suslov's report, was cold and hostile. The secretaries of the regional committees and ministers who spoke after him, who had sworn allegiance to him only yesterday, now competed in using derogatory epithets. It was a classic Byzantine scene of a ruler being overthrown by his own courtiers. In his speech, Shelepin added to Suslov's ideological accusations some very mundane ones. He spoke of nepotism, the promotion of Ajube's son-in-law, expensive gifts to foreign leaders, and the luxurious lifestyle of Khrushchev's family. It was a blow below the belt, aimed at the rank-and-file members of the Central Committee. Immediately after Khrushchev's resignation, a quiet but total dismantling of his legacy began. Industrial and rural party committees were immediately merged, Sovnarkozy were liquidated, and central ministries were restored. The apparatus breathed a sigh of relief. An era began that would later be called stagnation, but for Suslov, it was a time of triumph for his ideas. Stability of personnel, collective leadership, at least in words, the end of risky experiments, the freezing of de-Stalinization, all this was the realization of his program. He did not become the head of state. He did not need that. He remained what he was, the supreme ideologist, the Grey Cardinal, who ensured that the ship of the Soviet state would never again deviate from what he considered to be the only correct dogmatic course. In this sense, October 1964 was not so much a victory for Brezhnev as it was a triumph for Mikhail Andreevich Suslov. He did not simply remove a man from power, he stopped time. This ideological chasm was exacerbated by a deep personal antipathy, which Khrushchev, without realizing it, constantly fueled. A man of action, he despised desk work and paperwork, and never missed an opportunity to mock Suslov, calling him behind his back our chief accountant or paper pusher. For Nikita Sergeyevich, who was accustomed to solving problems on the fly, on impulse, Suslov's methodical accuracy and his endless references to the classics of Marxism were manifestations of cowardice and dogmatism. Suslov, for his part, silently endured these humiliations, but each one was stored in his memory. He saw Khrushchev not simply as a political opponent, but as a bringer of chaos. A man who, with his unpredictability and rudeness, was destroying the sacred order of party power. In his office, where the books of Marx and Lenin stood on shelves with mathematical precision and every document lay in a strictly defined folder, there was no place for Khrushchev's improvisation. And he waited, with the patience of an entomologist observing a busy insect, for that insect to finally get tangled up in its own web. The key moment that transformed silent irritation into a willingness to act was the same 22nd Congress. In addition to removing Stalin's body, a new third CPSU program was adopted there. This document, written under Khrushchev's dictation, proclaimed that the current generation of Soviet people will live under communism, and promised to build the material and technical basis of a communist society by 1980. For Suslov, this was not just a utopia, it was an ideological crime. Marxism, as he understood it, was a rigorous scientific theory operating on the objective laws of historical development. Khrushchev, however, turned it into a circus, a set of empty promises, replacing scientific analysis with administrative enthusiasm. Setting an exact date for the arrival of communism was as absurd as setting a date for the second coming of Christ. It was the very same voluntarism, but elevated to the rank of party doctrine, a mortal sin in the eyes of the ideological inquisitor. Against this backdrop, another drama unfolded, the split with China. Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party perceived de-Stalinization as betrayal, revisionism. And it was Suslov, as the chief ideologist, who had to argue with his Chinese comrades, defending Khrushchev's line at international meetings, which he considered disastrous in his heart. This put him in a humiliating position.
He was forced to defend heresy, which only strengthened his belief in the need to rid the party of this heretic. In his opinion, Khrushchev not only caused turmoil within the country, but also destroyed the monolithic unity of the world communist movement, losing China as an important ally. But the last straw that broke the camel's back for the entire party apparatus was Khrushchev's proposal, which he intended to formalize at the next plenum. It concerned the introduction of a clause into the party constitution on the systematic rotation of personnel, which would limit the tenure of elected party positions, including the highest ones, to 2 or 3 terms. For the nomenclature, for whom a party post was a lifetime sinecure, a guarantee of stability and privileges, this was tantamount to a death sentence. Khrushchev was threatening the most sacred thing, their personal well-being and confidence in the future. It was at this moment that the conspiracy turned from backroom talk into a concrete plan of action. And Suslov, as the defender not only of ideological dogma, but also of the caste interests of the apparatus, became its natural standard-bearer. He gave the nomenclature the highest sanction. Their struggle for their seats was not a selfish interest, but a struggle for the stability of the party ranks against destructive adventurism. At that very October plenum of 1964, when Khrushchev's fate had already been decided, only one person from the entire presidium of the Central Committee, Anastas Mikoyan, dared to speak in his defense. He cautiously spoke of Khrushchev's merits and the inadmissibility of such methods of removal, trying to appeal to collective responsibility. But his voice was drowned out by the icy silence of the hall. Suslov's ideological artillery preparation had done its job. Anyone who dared to support Khrushchev automatically became an accomplice to his voluntaristic mistakes.
Mikoyan spoke into the void, addressing people who had already made their choice. After it was all over, and the former first secretary, who had suddenly become a personal pensioner of Union significance, left the Kremlin, Suslov did not participate in the banquets and victory celebrations. He returned to his office on Stara Square. The first thing he did was personally proofread and sign off on the editorial for tomorrow's issue of Pravda. It did not mention Khrushchev at all. In dry, impersonal language, it spoke of the need to put an end to subjectivism and projectism and return to Lenin's norms of collective leadership. For him, this was not a personal victory. It was a restoration of order. The chaotic, unpredictable element had been removed from the system, and now it could return to its usual stable state. The machine of state ideology, cleansed of malfunctions, was once again running smoothly and silently, lulling the country into a long era of stagnation. An analysis of reliable facts leads to the conclusion that the confrontation between Suslov and Khrushchev was primarily ideological differences, and a desire to preserve the communist system rather than personal revenge. This reminds us how political decisions are often determined by goals rather than emotions. That's all for now. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and see you next time.